All right, we are now live. This is the Art of the Right podcast. This is going to be our pilot episode, and we're going to be discussing No Country for Old Men. I'm Isaac Young. This is John Slaughter. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. I managed to get my kids locked away quiet, so hopefully we can do this with no interruptions.
Yeah. Let me check for one moment because I'm not sure this is recording. I hope it is.
It says
Uh,
live on my end, so hopefully it's
okay.
recording.
Yeah, it popped up a banner on this end. I guess it doesn't really matter if this is like. Do you care if I somehow don't get like a recording of this first episode? And this is
No,
just
it
like
doesn't
a.
matter.
All right, all right. Fair enough. Fair enough. We can figure that out later. Anyways, so I guess the best place to start is our experiences with Cormac McCarthy and No Country for Old Men. Do you want to hit it off?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big McCarthy fan. Like I was telling you earlier, I've read most of his work, pretty much everything except for Stella Maris and whatever the other one is. I haven't read the two newest books, but I've read um, I've read everything from his, what I consider is like Appalachian arc, which is or his more Southern Gothic arc, which is like his first couple novels, and then he moves to the West with, of course, Blood Meridian, and then you have the Border trilogy, and then of course No Country for Old Men kind of comes sort of on the end of that, which. For those who don't know, I think it was originally a screenplay that got turned into a book or a novel. So that's probably why it translates so well to film, because his original intention was to be that. But that was, as far as film adaptations, this was the first McCarthy film I ever saw. Which of course there's only this in the road. But I remember seeing it, and the first time I saw it, I was younger, and it kind of blew me away, but I couldn't quite understand it because I was a kid, because it was like 2007 when it came out. So I was in high school, so most of the themes kind of went completely over my head. But even then, I remember um, just being kind of left with this weird empty sense at the end of the film. So even then, it had an impact. And then I went and revisited it multiple times as an adult. So I would say my first experience with this particular work was the film, and it was a gut punch even for somebody who didn't quite understand what they were watching.
Yeah, so for my particular experience with it, I was sort of peripherally aware of Cormac McCarthy for a long time. I didn't really understand his significance to the American literary scene until up until maybe like a year ago. And even then I wasn't I'm not very interested in westerns. And his whole I'm very much a sci-fi fantasy person, as people could probably tell from my profile picture. So I was peripherally aware, and then I recall when he passed away this year in 2023 that sorry, passed away last year in 2023. A bit of a brain fart there. That there was this huge upswelling on Twitter about this great author, and I was like, all right, I gotta go check out his work. So I sat down, I purchased Blood Meridian, No Country for Old Men, The Road. I read through No Country for Old Men, watched the movie of No Country, watched the movie The Road, and then I sort of got distracted. But my initial reaction to No Country was I was very captivated by it. And then what was really interesting to me was what happened during the second and third acts, which were very non-traditional end to a story, and that sort of that really captivated my interest in the movie, and that's sort of why I wanted to bring it up to talk with you today.
Yeah, I think that that experience is pretty common for a lot of people, because most people I've talked to about this, the most people have seen the film. Obviously, they've not actually read the novel. They expect Llewellyn to be the main character, and so when he just sort of like dies off screen, right? They're completely thrown off by it because they don't understand what the film is actually about, what the story is actually about. And I've noticed that that's sort of a common theme for most people, unless they take the time to really pay attention and read it. Because I was telling you before, my I just watched it like a few weeks ago because my wife had never seen it, and I didn't tell her anything. I just let it go, and I watched her reaction to him. They just kind of, he's at the hotel, and then all of a sudden he's dead, and she was very confused. And I think that's the reaction most people have when they first see it, which is part of its staying power. But I think the other part of the film that makes it so impactful, and the novel, is what the story is actually about, which I think takes a little bit. It takes a second or third watch for most people, myself included, to really understand what this story is trying to say.
So I think the next segue to that is, what do you think this story is trying to say?
Well, I think McCarthy has a couple of things going on in here. It's easier to understand, I think, within the body of his work when you read his other westerns, and his sort of commentary on the frontier dying. And I think the larger picture is what you're seeing is time has passed. You call them Anglos, these Americans. There's a new frontier coming up from Mexico. The cartels are violent, they're ruthless, and both Llewellyn, who is a Vietnam veteran in the film, um, and the sheriff, they both have lost a step, right? And they can't keep up with what's going on, and they're faced with this new, more barbarous group of individuals. And I think that's part of the main theme, is their inability to confront what is now in front of them because they've gotten soft, right? Because they've created this, they've tamed the frontier and they've grown soft, and now the frontier is back, um, and they don't know how to handle that.
Yeah, for myself, when I read the book and I was really thinking it over, I was thinking this is definitely a book, at least tangentially, about collapse. At least that was how my interpretation of it was. So I saw Ed Tom. He's this uh, Greatest Generation World War II vet. The way I specifically remember the way the book opens is he's talking about this kid who is 19, and this kid is essentially, for lack of a better word, demonically possessed, and he's been trying. This kid has been trying to kill someone for as long as he can remember, and he enjoys killing, and he's a psychopath. And Ed Tom doesn't know what to make of this phenomenon. And the way I saw it through Ed Tom is, Ed Tom is sort of I don't doubt that he's a Christian, because most guys of that period were, but it's a soft Christianity. It's a Christianity that's really lost the vitality. And what you're seeing with this is where Christianity is gone soft. It's breaking apart. These cracks are starting to appear in society. You have these demonic elements which were previously suppressed now coming to the fore again, and they have no idea how to deal with it. And the way I saw Llewellyn was he's a cynic born out of the soft generation. I don't want to say soft, but that's sort of how the book portrays it anyway. And he knows that systems are breaking down, that the old rules are sort of going away, and he's trying to get what's his while he still can. And that sort of begins the Faustian bargain, the Faustian overreach.
Yeah, I always found that interesting, that there's subtle clues to the fact that And I don't remember how explicit it was about talking about Llewellyn's Vietnam experience. I know in the film it's mentioned only one single time, sort of like an off piece of dialogue. But when I see Llewellyn, that's sort of I see the same thing. This sort of overreach, this inability to walk away and to know his limits. And I think he still thinks. I think he thinks he's something he's not, right? Which is also probably a commentary on the American society at large, whether it is through a Christian lens or just through the lens of masculinity in America, where he still thinks that he has it, and he does, as he gives a Chigurh a run for his money, and you can kind of tell, at least in my opinion, that maybe a younger, sharper Llewellyn would have come out on top in that situation, because he is crafty, he's smart, but he just doesn't have that edge, right? And then to contrast him with Tom, Tom is trying to operate in a world where, like as you said, he's this greatest generation guy, and I kind of see him as taking certain things for granted that he doesn't realize don't exist anymore, right? Like these morals, these values, these things that he grew up with, that he has forgot where they come from because he was just sort of giving to them, right? This idea that people are going to be honorable is just sort of an a priori assumption on his part, but that isn't the case, and he doesn't quite understand it.
Yeah, and I'd say so. I want to speak about Llewellyn first because the thing that struck me, at least I recall in the book, that what gets Llewellyn in trouble is not that he steals the money; it's that he goes back to give water to the dying man. That's what sets
Yeah.
Anton and the others on his trail. And if Cormac McCarthy were still alive today and I had the opportunity to speak with him, I'd be very interested in hearing his answer. Should Llewellyn have taken the money? And do you think he should have went back to give water to the dying man? Now, the second question, like obviously, people would lean towards no because that's what eventually gets him killed. But should Llewellyn be a wolf, like out of I guess one of those movies, Sicario? You ever seen that one?
Yeah, Sicario. Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because this is a theme which I know you haven't read Blood Meridian yet, but there's a theme in a lot of McCarthy's work that I guess you say no good deed goes unpunished, right? And it's probably where a lot of people will draw out the nihilism within McCarthy's work, right? Because in both of those novels, it is the act of kindness that the protagonist engages in that sort of costs them their life.
Yeah, and I wish I could pick Cormac McCarthy's brain on whether or not, because that would separate him from the nihilists. Is do you think that you should pursue the good despite it eventually resulting in your destruction? Or do you think that Llewellyn should have just been an out and out cynic? He shouldn't have gone back. He should have taken the money and he should have ran before they even got on his trail. And for myself, I would, I would, I mean, from my read of Cormac McCarthy, I think that he would have fallen on the side of giving water to the dying man anyway, just from what I've seen of The Road. I don't know how The Road falls in the timeline of his work, but it seems that he would still advocate for the retaining your humanity path. But
No,
you know him better than I.
no, I would agree with that. I think both The Road and No Country fall towards the latter end of his catalog of work, whereas Blood Meridian comes sort of closer to the front end. And in that novel, the kid has an opportunity to kill the judge and doesn't, and this comes back to bite him later. in the similar way that Llewellyn's decision to give water to the dying man allows him to be tracked down. But I do think that an older McCarthy, and of course, by the time he's written The Road and No Country, he has a son. Yeah, he's been married, I think, once or twice. So he has more going on in his life, and I think that sort of nihilistic streak in him softens, right? And he starts to take a more human approach. But he never quite loses, at least in my opinion, a touch of nihilism. And it might even be that you can see in his work that he does believe that people should do the right thing, but he still thinks that it's going to cost you. And maybe he thinks that's a good trade-off. Maybe, I don't know. I couldn't quite say, because he kind of leaves things open-ended. But I do think, we'll get to this later, not now, but I do think the closing monologue has a lot to do with answering this question in the novel and in the film.
Yeah, I definitely have a lot of thoughts in that monologue, but I guess in order to not jump around, maybe we should stay towards the beginning. I guess the next major thing that comes to my mind is the character of Anton Chigurh. I feel like he is. So I have mixed feelings on Chigurh. I'll let you talk about him first, sort of to get this ball rolling, though.
Yeah, I think Chigurh is an interesting. He's an interesting villain because he, as much as he's ruthless and vicious, he does have. I don't want to call it a code per se, but he seems to believe in fate, right? This particularly comes to mind the coin flip scene with the older guy. I don't remember his name, the store clerk, and then also again with Llewellyn's wife. And thinking in both of those terms, I kind of, a lot of people want to make this assumption that Chigurh is sort of a stand-in for the devil. I'm not quite married to that idea, but I do think the opportunity he gives with chance is sort of an allusion to maybe a more metaphysical representation of Chigurh. But like I said, I'm not married to that as much as I would be like the judge in Blood Meridian. But I think one thing that really that people find so riveting about Chigurh is the fact that he's this cold, calculated killer, and we don't really know enough about him to understand his motivations fully. But he has this ability to make you not necessarily empathize with him, but sort of understand his perspective without. There's not a ton of dialogue from him, but I've always found him very interesting, and I found other people find him interesting, and I think it's because there's some code that motivates him, and I've never been able to put my finger on it. But I think that's kind of what allows him to stand out from just your traditional villain, your traditional antagonist.
So I tried to dig into Anton Chigurh's moral code, and the conclusion that I eventually came to was that it's sort of a bit of a red herring, because throughout the story, it's undermined several times, and it's shown to be sort of something Chigurh tries to hold himself to, but it's by no means a rigid thing, because at the end of the story he kills Carla Jean. But even earlier we get a premonition of this when he does the coin flip with the gas station owner, and at the end when the gas station owner passes the test, or I wouldn't say test, but passes the coin flip, what happens is Anton basically says, don't put it in your pocket, because that's your special coin. That's the coin that, without saying in so many words, that's the coin that purchased you your life. But at the very end of the monologue, he says, he undercuts even this, and he says, oh, but that's just a regular coin. That's not anything special. And the way I've grown to interpret this is, and I'm not sure how much of this is intentional on McCarthy's part, But my personal interpretation of Chigurh's moral code is that as the rules of society are breaking down, as the old order collapses and the frontier returns, what you're going to see is you're going to see a lot of human interaction that's no longer mediated by this cold, calculating, indifferent, orderly justice system. But you're gonna see human interaction governed by this really Byzantine sort of, there's trying to be a structure to it, but also it's sort of mediated by personal whims at the time. This chaotic thing, which is self-contradictory, inconsistent, but there's still something of the human soul trying to impose order however it can.
You know what it reminds me of? There's a story. I don't remember who tells it, but it's a story about it's like a hermit or something. It doesn't really matter. But the point is, he's traveling down the road, and as he's traveling down the road, he comes into a young man, and the young man is talking to him, and he says, "Oh, I only go where God leads me." And he said, "So what happens when you come to a fork in the road?" He says, "Well, I throw this stick in the air, and whichever direction it falls is the path I go. It's where God tells me." He said, "Well, what if it goes the direction you don't want to go?" He goes, "Well, I just throw it up until it goes the direction I want." Right. And it reminds me of that to an extent, right? Because that's what Chigurh sort of does. I think you're right. Like he has this code and he'll stick to it until it reaches a point where he doesn't want to, right? And that is probably very much a commentary on this moral code that's coming back with the frontier, where people will stick to these belief systems or these ideas that they have until those ideas conflict with their own desires.
Yeah, and then it's well, I'm certain you're going to have both types of people who are so superstitious that the beliefs govern their actions more firmly than Chigurh's, and then you'll have people like Chigurh who will use their belief system to play into their desires until the two finally contradict each other.
So let me ask you this. So what do you make of him going after Llewellyn's wife? Do you think that is strictly out of part of his code, or is it vindictive, or is it a little bit of both?
Now, if I were doing a character analysis out of a real psychopath, I would say it was vindictive. And that's probably like if a person like Anton Chigurh existed in real life, that's probably how their psychology would operate, because he would see it as Llewellyn is cheating me out of my sport. He's not playing fair. Therefore, I'm going to go after his family. But from his depiction in No Country, I'm really tempted to want to believe it's just impersonal business, and this is Chigurh trying to use whatever ends he can do to complete his job.
Interesting. Yeah, because I've always been kind of hung up on that, because he doesn't have to, right? It does. We don't know what happens, right? But he gets in a car accident right after that, so it does cost him something, right? And maybe that is, and maybe that's sort of a callback to the decision that Llewellyn makes, which this is a new thought. I've never really thought of this till now. We're discussing it, but it is a sort of a similar thing. He makes this decision to go back to do something that is unnecessary, except in his case, it's not altruistic at all, right? It's more vindictive, and it causes him to get injured, right? And presumably, for all we know, he could get caught. We don't know what happens, but I wonder if that was an intention of McCarthy's to sort of mirror those two decisions and the cost associated with them.
Yeah, the interesting thing about Chigurh's ending is that I really don't want to see it as this divine judgment upon him, because that would throw meaning right back into Chigurh's world, which is just Chigurh's world is pure chaos in my view. I kind of want him to just be taken out by a complete accident out of nowhere, just like how Llewellyn Moss got taken out.
Yeah, no, I I feel like it would destroy the story in my opinion, but everybody wanted that. You want him to get his, and you want there to be meaning and purpose, but I do think that would cheapen the story a bit. Um, I think I think McCarthy sort of teases you with that on purpose. You know, like you think, okay, there's going to be some justice here. At least he's gonna get his. And then right there, he sort of walks away from it.
Yeah, I think. All right, so the reason I really want it to be impersonal is because I don't think that's the thrust of the story. At least the characters themselves and how they play out. Um, I really don't want to say this is a story about Faustian bargains or Anton's divine judgment upon him or any of that. I just want to I want to look at this story and sort of separate all that traditional stuff that you would have in regular stories and see it as just a commentary on collapse, which I guess that's tempting for me because I like to see collapse in a lot of other stories. But I
Well, I
kind
think
of
that's a good way to look at it though, because if you look at McCarthy's larger work, there is no, at least in my opinion, and again, I haven't read his last two novels, but there is no uh, there's no God in the traditional sense in his novels. There's none of that. So it almost it would be disingenuous to try to view it through that lens. Whereas looking at it through the lens of collapse, whether it's from a societal level or the human level, as far as morals and values go, that's I think the proper way to look at most of his work.
yeah. I guess the word for it is I want to see Cormac McCarthy's novels as, at least this one, as entirely absent of Deus Ex Machina, and that robs it of the meaning that you would seek in a regular story. But that's not where he's going with the book. He's going somewhere completely different with because in a Deus Ex Machina story, or how do you say, a story where it would traditionally play out, you would have so Ed Tom would eventually catch up with Llewellyn, convince Llewellyn to give up the money and give up the chase. I guess you'd have the likable, personable Carson Wells tricking Anton Chigurh into getting in a gunfight with the police, and Chigurh gets gunned down, and Carson walks off with the money, and all's well that's end well. That would be the Deus Ex Machina traditional story, but uh, Cormac McCarthy doesn't want to go down that road. He wants to do something else.
No, I mean, and that's sort of par for the course for most of his for the majority of his work outside of, I would say, the Border trilogy, which is probably his most traditional type of stories. Um, I think. Well, I'm curious to get your thoughts on Tom overall as a character, because when I see him, I see sort of I almost see him the way I see boomers, right? Like my grandparents, and how they can't quite accept what has happened and what has changed. Um, they still want to believe in something that doesn't exist anymore. Um, they'll recognize that things are different. They recognize that things have deteriorated, that we're no longer in a high trust society. They recognize all that, but they still can't quite accept it for what it is. And I think when I see Tom, I see, even though he's, I guess he would technically be silent or greatest generation, not really a boomer, but I see that sort of the way I see, like I said, boomers, because he slowly comes to this realization that, one, he's too old. Two, things have actually changed to a point that he can't quite understand what's going on. And I think that also fits really well with him sort of embodying the traditional cowboy archetype, right? Because I kind of see him as this John Wayne character. But like if John Wayne was forced to realize what was really going on, if that makes sense.
I guess the antithesis to that would be Clint Eastwood's character in Unforgiven, where he's the old man who who's aged, but he hasn't been broken or made soft by the West. But the only thing that's really failing him is his body.
Well, see, I think that what's interesting about that, and not to get too much on a side tangent here, but and this has been talked about a lot, but when you look at the John Wayne versus Clint Eastwood Western, right? Um, Clint Eastwood, you could call them more deconstructionist Westerns, because they tend to, you could say, try to take a realistic look at the West, however you want to describe it. You could say it's deconstructionist, whereas John Wayne was always trying to uphold the archetype, this archetypal cowboy, the guy in the white hat that does the right thing. You know, usually, with the exception of a few films, he's always the very clean cut good guy who comes in and stands up for what's right. And that was intentional. If I remember correctly, John Wayne actually didn't want to do any films with Clint Eastwood because he thought his films were too violent and he didn't like the image that they sold of the West. So I think that's why I see Tom Bell as sort of the John Wayne character, because he has this he sort of has this fanciful idea of what it was like, because he's reflecting back on what it was like for his ancestors, right? And I think he still kind of holds on to that, but then as he sees the violence and the things that these cartels are doing, he slowly is coming to this realization that it's not what you thought it was, right? Maybe you lived in a golden age where the gates were locked and the barbarians were kept out, but now that's gone, and that was really that was sort of an anomaly. This is that normalcy, unfortunately, is returning through this violence, because that's the normal mode of the way humans operate.
Yeah, and I mean, it's just I really want to look at Ed Tom and and say he's a baby boomer, even though I know he's greatest generation. But I think a lot of things that went wrong with the baby boomers actually started with the greatest generation. Because we can talk about how the baby boomers absolutely made a mess of Christianity, but the greatest generation were the ones who raised them. So we also have to take that into account as well.
Well, and that might be, and I'm sure a lot of ink has been spilled on this subject, but I think that's largely due to the fact that they saw World War II, and then of course their grandparents and their parents in some cases would have seen the First World War. So a lot of the real faith was kind of crushed in that, I think. But then I also think part of the problem with Tom is, and this is also sort of a commentary on the from a veteran standpoint, you very much see the difference between the World War II and the Vietnam veteran, right? So Tom comes from this, the good war. We were the good guys. We did the right thing. We won. We can have our head held up high. And Llewellyn is this Vietnam vet. So the Vietnam vets didn't get that same treatment, and they were known to be less. They weren't as moral, let's say, or at least the image of them was not as moral as the World War II veterans, even though there wasn't that much difference. It's just the illusion of being the good guys was gone, right? And you kind of see that with the fact that even though Llewellyn's willing to go back and give water to the dying man, Llewellyn also is poaching, so he's willing to break the rules. He's willing to break the law. He's willing to go after the money. He's still willing to try to help somebody. But you get the feeling that Tom wouldn't have done any of those things other than try to help. Like he would have tried to help the guy, but he wouldn't have taken the money. He wouldn't be poaching or breaking the law. And I think that's the big difference between the two of them. You're seeing that generational divide. It's very clear to me, especially when you understand, at least in my opinion, that they're both war veterans and they represent the public opinion of that war in a lot of ways.
Yeah, definitely. The thing that struck me about Llewellyn is that he still embodies a strength that I see very, very absent today. And I know Cormac McCarthy published No Country for Old Men in 2005, and I was only 5 back then, so I don't know how different the country was, but the interesting thing to me is No Country for Old Men. It predicted the collapse. It predicted America's turn to cynicism. And on the poaching subject, I think that's there's a deeper commentary there on these rules and regulations which are stifling us and suffocating us. But that's a thread I'll leave alone for now. But the interesting thing is, No Country for Old Men doesn't predict what actually happened next. We didn't immediately turn into a land of wolves, so that's happening very quickly now, especially with the Haitians in Springfield. But we turned into a land of eunuchs immediately after that the when No Country was published, which I'm not sure Cormac McCarthy saw coming.
Well,
I
I think though that because of course you were, as you said, you were like 5, right? So this was also on the heels of 9/11. And what a lot of people, yeah, I watched this, people my age, in their mid 30s, core millennials, whatever you want to say, watched the turn through all media. And this is highlighted very much so in No Country, where the traditional stories, with your traditional archetypes, with the Deus Ex Machina, with all that kind of stuff, right? That all went out the window, and everything became cynical, and everything became hard and gritty. You saw this in the trend in the early 2000s with like there had to be a gritty reboot of everything, right? Batman's a great example. The last, you have the Schumacher Batman films, which are very comical, over the top. Well, when the remake comes, it's very down to earth. It's gritty. It's darker. Which now people kind of take for granted because so many of the younger people haven't seen the original Batman films and realize how campy and over the top they were. But there was this hard shift towards cynicism or realism, as a lot of people would say it, after 9/11. And I think that is something that McCarthy was tapping into, right? The entire, there was a lot of patriotism and optimism right after the attacks. We're going to go in there, and then Iraq happens. People start to realize what's really going on, and it became very cynical. And I think that's that's probably, in my opinion, what sort of was the catalyst for him predicting sort of the collapse, and maybe why he didn't quite get it correctly.
Yeah, I'm sort of left still like the collapse in No Country for Old Men. I still kind of I'd prefer that over our current situation right now. um
Yeah, there
because it
was no
just
troons in No Country.
I didn't have a drag queen story hour in No Country. Oh man.
It's kind of depressing when you look at it and you say, "Oh, maybe it was that would have been better," you know. But I mean, like I said, I think, and it could be that he's just so far ahead of the curve, right? Because what's going to happen? You could see, like you said, Sicario is a great example. It's sort of a very similar story. I mean, you can see that sort of start happening, especially in these border towns over time. And it might be a couple more generations because it's going to take younger people who don't have these sort of hangups that the older generation does, because there's no memory. And I've had this conversation a couple of times with other people where, like, my generation, the millennials, even more so than Zoomers, have this problem of being able. We know what it was like before, so the collapse is harder on us, or for some of us mentally, right? Because we know what things were like before, whereas the younger generation coming up, they don't know any different. So they're going to be able to adapt to these changes more so. And again, this goes back to Tom, right? Tom knew what it was like before, right? Adapting to this new vicious world is much more difficult for his character, even for than for Llewellyn. Even though Llewellyn shows us he is still softer than Chigurh, he is still more willing to bend the rules and more willing to have this moral gray area than Tom is, right? And I think that's something that's definitely there in the story.
Yeah, I sort of wish the collapse happened with a lot of Llewellyns running around, and a
Yeah,
lot of a lot of Gen Z and Gen Alpha running around.
yeah.
Um,
I'm not very. I'm not. I'm a millennial, but I'm not a fan of my people, I guess.
uh, Me too. Me too. I mean, like I look at Llewellyn and I sort of wish that was the strength that Gen Z embodied. The ability to go around the rules to do what's necessary. But unfortunately, and as I stated earlier, we didn't regress to a land of wolves. First, we regressed to a land of eunuchs, and I think that's going to make upcoming struggles a lot harder than it would have been otherwise. And I think we're sort of a unique historical moment in that, because in any other civilization, uh, had we been this soft, had we been ruled by such corrupt elites, had any other civilization found itself in as bad a situation we are right now, they would have been immediately conquered. But
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up because I remember I can't remember the town in Tennessee. There's a town in Tennessee, I believe it was, where the returning World War II veterans came home to their town being like extremely corrupt, and they literally like waged like a mini war, and took the town back. And you see that, and like the level of corruption there was nothing like we see now. Um, but you would never see that happen today.
oh no, no, not in the slightest. I mean, I mean, first off, we're gonna before we get down to anything, we have to get down to basic trust, which is all but evaporated today. I mean, you have a bunch of guys hanging out on Discord servers, but you know, just one of them has to be a Fed, and you know, the whole the party's up before it even began.
Well, I think that's, in my opinion, and this is when it comes to the collapse narrative. I think I think the only way out is through, and you have to have people go through a hardening phase, something that, it's the same reason that on a small scale why, and it's gotten soft now, but it's the same reason boot camp originally, especially if you look at like the old way, like Marine Corps boot camp used to be, it was extremely brutal, right? Or you look at like the Agoge with the Spartans, like you have to harden people in order for them to be prepared for this. And it's you have too many soft people, right? So the only way that we get through it is you're going to have to suffer, and it's going to be the younger ones that have grown up without the silver spoon, without life being easy, in order for that to ever change, right?
Yeah, and I just want to add to my comments earlier. In Minecraft,
Always in Minecraft.
it's always in Minecraft. Don't.
So I got to do a question. What did you think of the conversation that he had with what was his name, Ellis, in the story that Tom has when he visits Ellis?
So here's the thing. I wish I reread the book scene, because I know it goes a lot more in depth.
Hmm.
All I can recall right now is him sharing the dream, and that's
Hmm.
probably the most. Um, it's probably the most interesting part of it anyway, because I mean, my immediate reaction, my immediate interpretation to that scene is this is Cormac McCarthy laying out that winter is ahead,
Hmm.
but if we can survive it, go through it, that somewhere up ahead, um, we'll rediscover some grounding to some grounding in our lives, both to the past and the future, that will allow us to rekindle civilization in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that analysis. I think it very much is a commentary on even like you said, even in the winter, even when you can't keep that flame burning hot and bright where everybody could see it, right? We'll say somebody's still going to carry it on down the road so that eventually it can be rekindled to its full brightness, and that sometimes that's your job. And like you said, it gets passed down from generation to generation, right? If we look at it like father to son, um, his father essentially telling him like this is just the way it is, right? Someone always carries that fire. Someone always has to do that. And I think that's the hopeful message that he gives you, right? Is because and you do see this theme in McCarthy's larger work. Again, if you go back to like Blood Meridian, it's very clear that he has a cyclical view of history to some extent. Whether it's as in depth as like it was Spangler or Yaki or something like that is I don't know, but he clearly sees things cyclically, and and I think there's hope in that because, and that's how I view all cyclical histories, right? I think they're hopeful because they do promise a rebirth of some sort, but um, somebody again, back to the point about like these people have to be hardened to become tougher. That's part of carrying that fire, right? It might not be that strong for you, but you pass it on to your kids so it can be brighter.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Um, I mean, the $1 million question for all of us is what that future civilization will look like in some way, shape, or form. And unfortunately, I don't think we're going to have any good answers for what that is for the next few decades, at least.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see. It's hard to tell because I think we can look at history and we can look at all these examples, but a major collapse now, given if we try to compare it to like the Romans, right? The people that were in the wake of that, especially as sort of the tides of the empire really receded, they still had the skills and knowledge to survive, whereas now the average person has none, right? And that doesn't just pertain to sort of the ability to be a wolf or to be vicious like McCarthy's depicting, but also just in basic life skills. And that's the part that makes it hard to predict because it's like, well, if the internet, got cut off and all electricity got cut off tomorrow, how many people could actually feed themselves? Which I think that's an extreme version. I tend to subscribe to more catabolic collapse, but I think it makes it hard to predict.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the West is currently the problem is the West is currently negotiating the terms of its own collapse. So you can't really predict what's going to come out of it. I mean, for example, we have the election coming up with Donald Trump, and I don't think he's not going to be able to reverse the collapse. I don't think anyone thinks he's going to be able to do it. But if the best case scenario is if we sort of negotiate some sort of balkanization. But yeah, like the problem is we're still in that transitory stage where our elites are negotiating how bad things are going to get.
I
And we have the
wonder. Well, oh, that's fine. I was just wondering if because I agree with you. I think that the best case scenario with Trump, in my opinion, is buying time, right? Buying time to allow people to establish power centers at the local level in their areas and things like that, to give them some breathing room to kind of circle the wagons, if you will. Um, which again, to tie that back, that's the men and women that do that are the ones that are going to be able to to carry that fire, right? So if you balkanize, you could see the, if we want to call it the real spirit of America, as corny as that sounds, some group or some section would carry that on, right? Even if it's a small, tiny, subset in Tennessee or someplace like that, right? Somebody can carry that forward, and that's probably, again, like I said, that's where one thing I love about McCarthy's work is that on the surface, so many people will take it nihilistically, or they'll look at it as just being um, depressing. We'll say, like, for the average person, oh, it was sad, it was depressing, it didn't have a happy ending. But what I enjoy about it is that there is actually a happy ending if you're the type of person that understands. If you're more of a realist and you see the world in more real terms, you understand that there actually is a happy ending, right? Because he's telling you that there is a promise of tomorrow. He's just being realistic about the fact that there's no, the good guys don't ride off in white hats into the sunset.
Yeah, that's the thing that saves No Country from being a nihilistic story is that final dream with the fire. That's what saves it, in my opinion. Because if you cut that out, then I would really struggle to see Cormac McCarthy's notion of the transcendental. But the facts that he left in, and that's basically the last beat of the story, is the fire, and that's how he chooses to end it. I think Cormac McCarthy definitely sees. He's trying to see some hope out there, even in all the cold and the darkness.
Do you think that I've thought about this a lot, because I've been a McCarthy fan for a while, but I'm also, I have a proclivity for darker stories, things that I love the Southern Gothic. I really enjoy Flannery O'Connor and Faulkner and such. So I kind of like the darker, macabre or even semi-nihilistic stories. But I wonder if he's so appealing to so many of the younger guys in our generation or in your generation, because he's offering something that's more realistic. Like, is it harder for your generation to understand the more traditional storylines where the good guy wins and he gets the girl? When you look back at older media.
I wouldn't say it's necessarily harder to understand. The problem is that Gen Z sort of has at least in my view, a bit more of a warped relationship to storytelling and fiction, and just entertainment media. The problem is that a good chunk of what you view as art has been corrupted and degenerated into for lack of a better word, millennial wish fulfillment fantasies. Like, see a lot of stuff like Adventure Time,
Mm-hmm.
Where it's sort of this ongoing roller coaster ride. But I don't really understand the and I talked about this with the distributist. It's sort of like people are trying to escape into fiction rather than using fiction to inform their own lives.
It's interesting, because my oldest son is 11, and I've shown him cartoons from when I was a kid, right? And one of the ones that I don't remember which one was we watched recently, but anyways, it has it's a continual storyline. It wasn't at the X-Men animated series, but it was similar. Or Gargoyles is a good example of this, where, like, when I was a kid, they were storylines that built on each other, right? And you had to watch each episode, you had to understand it. There was there was gray areas, there was moral lessons, there was an actual story that made you feel something and understand something. It was a commentary on life. as opposed to, like you said, just this constant stream of, it's almost like this SpongeBobification of every type of media where everything is just a nonstop, like you said, roller coaster. It's very weird to me to watch it because I remember as a kid like having, like I said, I'm old enough that like I didn't have Cartoon Network, so I had to get up on Saturday and actually watch cartoons, and so you had to catch each episode, right? I was like the
Yes,
last,
I was
you
at the,
know.
yeah. Well, I mean, I was at the very very last. I remember doing that when I was young. I think that was still around in 2005 because I remember waking up early in the morning to watch Pokemon. They were
Well,
doing
and
sorry.
that actually has somewhat of a storyline, right? Like you can
Yeah.
follow, but I wonder if that's, I guess I wonder if that's part of McCarthy's appeal to so many of the younger guys, is because for a lot of people, he might be the first or the only encounter with what an actual narrative looks like. I'm not a fan. Well, I like genre fiction, but I prefer literary fiction. And I think so many people don't ever encounter that in any capacity. Story like character driven stories, and I think he gives you that to an extent. And I wonder if he appeals to people because he not only gives that, but he also gives you a. It's not done in a way that seems campy and over the top or corny. Because I do think sometimes some of the younger guys I run into, they see the the action heroes of like yesteryear is a little bit ridiculous, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess before we lose the thread entirely, to go back to my generation's relationships to media, I finally formulated. I think it's a lot like injecting heroin into your veins. Like that's
uh,
what it feels like to me. Is that people are just constantly binging,
Chasing the
constantly
dragon.
plugged in. Yeah,
That
and
makes sense.
that seems to be my like my generation's relationship. And so the question, can they understand more idealistic forms of media? They can. I don't think it's operating on that same level anymore where people are expecting media to fulfill a function beyond just getting entertainment out of it for its own sake.
It's interesting. It's interesting to see that shift. Like, if you compare obviously No Country to like a traditional Western, a John Wayne or something like Bonanza, it's almost laughable, right? But at the same time, I think No Country has a lot more merits because it's more realistic. And I don't. A lot of people like to kind of say that he's deconstructing. I mean, you'll hear people say that Blood Meridian's a deconstruction, right? Is a Western, but I don't necessarily look at it that way. I think he's dealing with reality. I think it's also colored by the fact that McCarthy has a very, I won't say nihilistic, but he does not have an optimistic view of humanity, which I think makes more sense because, as you alluded to earlier in the conversation, Tom, to take it back to the story, Tom, it comes from this generation that has this very watered down Christianity, right? So, like something like original sin does not exist for Tom or his generation, so to speak, the way it did for Christians prior to that. And I think McCarthy's view of humanity as this as dark and almost animalistic is closer in some ways to a Christian understanding of like the original sin of man, like man is fallen. And I think that's something that McCarthy does really well, which to me, I don't see it as a deconstruction because I think it's actually going back to what really is, if that makes any sense at all.
Yeah, I mean, I remember reading during my history class, first primary sources of the colonial period and pioneers' relationship with Native Americans, and it was vicious.
Hmm.
Like it was it was slaughter, it was scalping, it was all sorts of just vicious brutality that people have just completely forgotten these days. And unfortunately, it's making a comeback because people have forgotten that that's the norm of human history. I mean, the past 60 years, for all intents and purposes, have just been an anomaly.
Yeah, that's interesting because this kind of goes back to you're gonna have to have wolves, right? Like at the end of Sicario, this is the land of wolves, and you're not a wolf, or you could use the more what is the term they call, like, you'll hear people use the term like sheepdog, right? Because the sheepdogs has to be vicious enough to fight off a wolf, but also gentle enough to take care of the sheep and all that. So you kind of have to foster a generation of that. Um, and it doesn't come out of nowhere, and it can't just come out of the ether. It has to grow. And unfortunately, it does seem to me like um it can't grow without that pressure from the outside of the wolves, so to speak, because there's no need for it. And you see this throughout history, right? Or just in all sorts of ways. But the warrior or the hero is always hated during peacetime, right? Because and the
Yeah.
longer that peace goes on, the more he seems superfluous. Um, so I think that's definitely something that's going on there.
Yeah, I remember reading John Carter, and that was something that was present in the book. Is that he's a warrior who is now scorned not only because he fought on the wrong side, but because society doesn't have a place for him anymore. Because he's a fighting man. It's in his blood to be a warrior, and that's something that people can no longer really understand. And I think that's more to do with when Edgar Rice Burroughs wrote that book than it had to do with the actual time period. But it's still a lesson that is true nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean it's something that we a real life example. You can see these real life examples both after World War II and Vietnam, right? Immediately after the war, and especially after Korea's over, right? Like MacArthur, we don't need you anymore. You're great and you're awesome and you're this general that everybody praises, or something like Patton, right? But we don't need you now. You served your purpose. Now we're going to go back to things as they were before. After Vietnam, they did the same with Chesty Puller. Um, the wars are over. Goodbye. Like, get out of here. And I think the danger, and you see this, sort of with No Country with Tom, is it's if you go too long in that piece, you become soft, and you almost lose the ability uh, to recognize the coming storm until it's too late. And Tom does that, right? Because he's always a step behind, right? Because he can't quite. I think part of it's because he just doesn't have it anymore. He's tired, he's old, and he doesn't understand things, or he understands it, but he's slow on the uptake, I guess.
Yeah, I said I wrote an essay on No Country, and I said his flaw isn't that he fails to save Llewellyn. His flaw is that he gives up afterwards,
Yeah.
and it's sort of this thing that I really have to criticize him for, because at the end of the story, he sort of throws his hands up and resigns
Mhm.
himself as a ghost, when the honorable thing to do, the thing that would have made him a Theoden character instead of a Denethor character, is he should have done his best to impart what he knows, because his deputies are even more actually that's a point I missed. His deputies are more are sorry, not more, less men than he is,
Yeah.
because they're bumbling and ridiculous even more so than he is. He's like he's I guess he's a bit more refined, a bit more serious, but they're just downright comical. Those are the equivalent of the Zoomers. Uh, um, those are the equivalent of the Zoomers that I mistakenly said were missing.
Or we could call them maybe Gen Xers. Could they be Gen X?
Yeah, I think they'd be.
Something like that. It could be
I,
millennials,
I
bro.
think Llewellyn's a baby boomer,
Right, yeah, because he's
um,
a
and
Vietnam vet.
so yeah, they might have been Gen Xers. I don't
Yeah,
know.
but the analogy still holds, right? And I think that again has to do with Tom is the last generation with any real contact to anything. But you know, it's weird because, like as you said before, you want to call Tom a boomer because of the way he behaves, but he's supposed to be Gen X,
Oh, sorry, Greatest Generation.
or Greatest Generation. Yeah, excuse me. Yeah, but he has sort of tendencies, I guess, of both to an extent. Or maybe Llewellyn is the failure of, because generationally he would have been the failure of the Greatest Generation, right? And the failure of Llewellyn's generation is these bumbling idiots that Tom now has to deal with, right?
Yeah.
It just kind of trickles downhill. But I don't know. I think the generational thing is a strong current in there, and I wonder. I don't know that was necessarily intentional. I think that's probably just McCarthy recognizing the behavior patterns of people from those specific generations, not necessarily trying to point them out specifically. He probably just I will imagine he at least recognized that generation was sort of the high watermark, I guess you could say, or the one that came right after that.
So we're past the hour mark. I think we can start winding it down. Let's see. I don't have any entropy chats or anything to set up, so if there's anyone still watching, feel free to type some questions into the chat. I'll see them. In the meantime, I guess, do you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, I really, and I did this. I want to harp on the fact that there's 3 more hours. I want to harp on the fact that there's not 3 more hours, but there's a line of hope at the end of this story. And the reason I think that's important to highlight is because it's such a contrast to what everybody else has read from him, which is Blood Meridian, which in my opinion ends very nihilistically. And I think this is this sort of pushes back on that idea, because when you see the end of it, despite everything, despite the fact that, if we look at it on a grand scale and we say, look, the Anton Chigurhs are coming, they're here, whether they're eating your cats or they're taking over your apartment complex in Denver or whatever, they're here, but the future can be bright, and it's sort of what you make it. But unfortunately, you have to realize that it's not you that's going to do it, right? It's not you, and it's probably not your kids. It's just your job and your kids' job to carry that fire onward. And I think if people keep that in mind when they read this story, because I think, I'm a firm believer that you really haven't read a story till you've read it twice, because once you understand that ending and you reread it or you rewatch it, you see that and you understand what's going on, and that unfortunately is as the sort of the frontier approaches, your kind of job is to just keep things going so that younger people can rebuild.
Yeah, I have no disagreements here. I think
you do have one question, though.
Yeah, I do. Now I see it. We'll get to it. So I think my final thoughts on No Country for Old Men is that I really want to see the sequel, even though that's never going to happen because Cormac McCarthy's dead. But I feel like there's the very end with the dream sequence, where he talks about the dream. I really would have liked a Cormac McCarthy novel about that winter. And I suppose that exists in the Form of the Road, which would probably get more at what he's talking about. I really want to see what that fire looks like, and how to get to it through the winter, which I would have loved more of Cormac McCarthy's thoughts on that, because he seems to be at least for No Country, it seems to be more descriptive rather than proscriptive. And I would have liked to see his thoughts on what should have happened, or what should happen going forward.
Well, I don't know that. I guess I've never read his last two books, but in everything else I read, I never saw him give a prescription other than there's a light at the end of the tunnel, but you just got to get there.
Yeah. All right. So, aspiring misanthrope question: what is Llewellyn's great flaw and great strength? I'll leave that to you to go first.
Well, I would say his greatest flaw, I think his greatest flaw is the fact that he's somebody that, I'm trying to think of the right way to articulate this. He wants, I think when he takes the money, I think when you look at his larger life, at least in my opinion, he's a man that's very capable, but kind of wants to take, I want to say take the easy road, but he's willing to cut corners and do the wrong thing when nobody's looking. And I think that's sort of his greatest flaw, is that he doesn't quite have the moral character he needs to do the right thing. Like, yeah, that money's there, walk away from it. You know, he is a good person in the sense that he's, you know, he goes back and gives this guy water because he can't live with himself, right? But at the same time, he can't deny himself. And maybe it is that Faustian overreach. He can't deny that part of himself, and I think that's his greatest flaw. I think his greatest strength is that he's a man of considerable ability. Now it's sort of rusted and waned a little bit, but he gives as much as he takes with Chigurh. He can hold his own with him one-on-one, and I think that's a testament to sort of his strength of character, that it's there, and that's his greatest strength. But it just doesn't ever, unfortunately, because McCarthy's such a realist, he kind of shows you that sometimes you can see that in somebody, but they never actually fully manifest it.
So, for my personal take, the way I view it, I don't think Llewellyn is necessarily wrong for taking the money. I think the problem is that he inhabits the wrong frame when he does it. Because when he takes the money, he sort of inhabits this half and half world of where he wants to be the good guy in a wolf eat wolf situation, and he gets eaten because of it. If he inhabited the frame of, let's say, I'm going to get in this game of being a conqueror, which unfortunately isn't possible for his time period in America, and sort of gather a group of outlaws, or something along those lines, of where he places himself as a man exerting power rather than playing this cat and mouse game. I feel like the story would have ended very differently if he inhabited those sorts of frames rather than really being small-minded. Because he takes the money and he runs, and he doesn't think beyond the next 3 steps ahead.
That's a good point. I never thought about, like, if he had, instead of running, like you said, if he had fought back immediately, right?
Or like if he had contacts where he gathers together a group of contacts and they use this money to build something.
No man is an island. Yeah.
Yeah, and because he's alone, he gets eventually gets knocked off, because that's just what happens to alone men when they engage in these sorts of power games. Is the system takes them out eventually. You can't run forever. Let's see, one more. We asking about Sheriff Bells, so I'll pass the torch to you again.
Oh, that's hard, because It's hard to articulate. Well, it's hard for me to find something that I think is a great strength of Bell's, because I feel like every strength he has is atrophied, right? Like it's there, but it's all it's been hung up so long that it doesn't operate properly. I mean, his weakness, I think, is an easy one to kind of pick out, because it's either um, it's either his willingness to give up, right? Because he's tired, right, and he's old. So it's sort of his what would we say, his it's not a weakness of character, right? But it's his age, maybe, and his lack of belief. I think maybe it's more his belief is not quite there, right? It's not what it should be. So even what, the captain should go down with his ship, he should have still tried to go after Chigurh, but once the crime is done and everything seems to be finished, he doesn't chase those loose ends because he just doesn't care anymore. So I think that's sort of his weakness, that he doesn't care anymore, and he's tired, and I think that's all rooted in his lack of actual true belief. Because I think as much as he tries to be this character that is, this reminiscent of this old cowboy, he's actually much more nihilistic deep down than I think he lets on. But as far as his strength goes, it's really difficult for me to assign anything to him, because the things I see that he's extremely intelligent, and he's right even in his old age, he's right on the heels of Chigurh and Llewellyn, but he's too old, right? And it goes back to my earlier point. So that would be his strength. I just don't, Yeah, I think Mythostor's right. He has the wisdom. He's very smart. He's very wise. So yeah, thanks for saving me from trying to figure that one out.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to dispute. I think so. Here's the thing with Ed Tom, is that he's sort of for him, this cat and mouse game, he sort of stakes his ability to do good on the world on finding Llewellyn. And I think that's sort of where you find his greatest strength and his greatest flaw, is because he sort of adopts this single-minded, if I can just get to Llewellyn, if I can just save this kid, I can rest easy knowing that I did some good. And I think that's what we can credit Ed Tom for, is he wants to do good. And I see that as his greatest strength, is that there's this desire there. But as you said, his old age, his lack of understanding about the world, his and his despair, it gets to him in the end, and it crushes that light that should have. Again, he should have. Like in a better world, he would have been a Theoden character, but instead, Denethor caught up with him in the end, and yeah, his greatest flaw is definitely despair.
Well, oh God, I want to like Tom so much as a character. I was thinking about him, like and maybe it's because when I see him, Tommy Lee Jones did such a good job. That's all I see. So yeah, I don't like him.
The actor Tommy Lee Jones, he has a charisma of being that grouchy uncle that you really like, because he has this sort of wit about him, and yeah, in some sense, I think Ed Tom was both cast really perfectly and really terribly, because I feel like if another actor tried their hand at Ed Tom, we'd all hate him.
Oh yeah, probably. I mean, well, the guy that plays his his cousin, What's his name? Remember he has the conversation in the film when he goes to his house, and he tells him it's not about you. Remember that part?
Vaguely.
I can't remember the guy's name. That guy could have pulled it off.
Hmm.
That's about the only other person I can think of. But no, he's a character that I want to like, and maybe that's also just a part of who that generation is, because I want to like boomers sometimes. Like, I want to like you, but you just make it difficult.
You're just fucking up every single time.
It's like, I keep giving you chances and you shit on the carpet.
Yeah. Well, on that really uplifting note, I think we're gonna call it and the stream.